Hello, world. It's me, Dennis. It was my great pleasure to have had a reasonably spontaneous conversation with the iconic author Lois Lowry in August of 2024. Lois was in her summer home in Maine, and we discussed her life and times as well as delving deep into her best known novel, The Giver. This is part one of our RSC, and we begin with 11-year-old Lois. It's 1948 in post-World War II Japan, and she was there with her family as her father was a dentist and an officer in the United States Army.
Japan at that time, as you point out, is just 3 years after the war has ended. Tokyo was rubble. They had quickly built houses for the incoming Americans, like my family. I'm the middle of three children. I have, at that point, an older sister who is, if I'm 11, she's 14, and my little brother, who's 5. Okay. Sister doesn't want to move from where she's just entering high school and has a boyfriend in Pennsylvania. So she's little brother doesn't care where he lives as long as he can take his toy trucks. And I was so excited, quietly excited about going to a foreign country, an adventure. I had been a prolific reader and had read stories of Japan, and but I was a great introvert, very shy child. So I didn't share my feelings enormously with my family. And they didn't know that I thought we were going to be wearing Japanese clothes, eating with chopsticks. Miraculously, I would speak Japanese right away. And it took me by surprise when, after a long voyage by boat from New York down through the Panama Canal, a month to get to Tokyo, actually to Yokohama, Dad picks us up in Yokohama and drives us to Tokyo, which is very nearby. And I'm looking out the car windows at this, as I described, rubble. People living in cardboard boxes. It was a devastated country. And then suddenly we arrive at this walled compound with little American-style houses, and Dad says, this is where we're going to live. But he had whispered something to me on the way there. He said, I have a surprise for you. And what it was a bicycle. He had bought me a bicycle. And so we were not captive in that compound. I went by bus every day to an international school, but I could ride my bike wherever I wanted. And in those days, whatever country you lived in those days, parents weren't helicopters as they are now. I could go out on that bike in the morning and not come back till dinner time. And nobody ever said, where's Lois? Because they knew I was exploring. And I would go out through the gate. I would see, actually, I'm remembering now, I would see the lines of Japanese women lined up to show their ID to come in to work for the American families. We had 3 maids in our house, and they were young women who had lost everything, probably their fathers and their boyfriends or their husbands, fiancés, but they were wonderful women. At any rate, I would ride past them out into the community. The area where we lived, if you know Tokyo at all, was called Shibuya. And if you go to Tokyo now, and I've been there several times in recent years, Shibuya is a thriving, busy, noisy, popular, sophisticated area. But at the time, it was like everything else. It had been devastated by the war. But I used to ride my bike. And if anybody noticed, well, of course they noticed me. I was a blonde child in this alien community, but they were very kind. And the only intrusive thing, though I didn't think of it that way at the time, is every now and then a Japanese person would touch my hair because blonde hair was still unusual to them.
Of course.
Uh, and gradually I picked up a little Japanese, but it wasn't that I was out there talking to people.
No.
I was just observing. I have always been a very observant person. I think most writers are. You have to
Mhm.
be. And
Absolutely.
so those 3 years that I spent in that country, they just loom in my memory and imagination as a magical time. I loved my time in that country. I love going back, and I always want it to be the same way it was. And of course, things don't stay that way.
No. Had you picked up a pen at that time? Had you started little beginnings of the writing?
Uh, some years back, I was speaking at happened to be Brigham Young University, and I mentioned this that my first published writing was when I was 10 years old, and I had written a letter to a children's magazine to which I subscribed. Someone gave me a subscription to Jack and Jill magazine every year.
Remember it well.
Day.
Yes.
And they had 2 pages in the middle. I don't want to call it the centerfold because that has connotations, but of letters from children. And I wrote letters to that magazine all the time. But it wasn't until I was 10, the summer I was 10, August. I remember the time of year because I was at summer camp. And my mother, these of course are pre-email days, pre-cell phone days. My mother wrote me a letter and said she had had a telephone call from Jack and Jill magazine that they were publishing my letter in the August issue, and she would send a copy to me. I was at camp for 2 months. And so I was very excited by that. At the same time, now I'm going into too much detail, but I was also very apprehensive because I had told a lie at summer camp. I mentioned that I was always a very observant child,
Mhm.
but also very shy and introverted. I noticed at summer camp when I arrived, the counselors, this was a girls' camp, the people, the women, young women who took care of us, supervised us, were college girls. And I noticed when they asked about kids' families, they paid more attention to, and therefore I thought liked better, the little girls who had brothers in college. So uh, I had a vivid imagination. And so I told them that I had a little brother and I had a big sister. And I also had a brother who went to Princeton. I didn't know anything about colleges, but the name Princeton had been bandied about in my family because of an uncle. And so I just threw that in, and that got me a lot of popularity among the college girl counselors. However, I also remembered that the letter I wrote to Jack and Jill magazine, which my mother was going to send to me, said, I have one brother, Johnny, who is 4 years old, and a sister who is 13. And I knew I was going to be busted. However, my mother sent the magazine. And the reason I even mention this whole magazine letter story is because one thing that was true that I said in the letter was, I want to be a writer. I am writing a novel. It is called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. And that was true. I was always, in answer to your original question, writing a novel or a story or poems. I'm now remembering a whole other story has to do with my poetry. But at any rate, so that this, I mentioned that at Brigham Young University, and there was a energetic graduate student who went to, I don't know how he found it, but he sent me a copy of the magazine, which I hadn't seen for many years. And there was that letter. And I remember mother sending it to me, and I looked inside to see my name in print. And then I hid it in the trunk under my bed, and no other child saw it. So I wasn't busted after all. I got away with, as we say, the big lie.
The big, yes, well, yes, and were our big lies that big? That would be wonderful. So, all right. So, did you companion poetry and prose at that young age?
It was the manipulation. That has a
Of
bad.
words and concept, because so much of what when I read your work slowly because I see that you craft your sentences.
And I guess I always did that even at age 10. Um, the the reason I mention poetry is because I also, wrote poems at that time. I even
Mhm.
hesitated to call it poetry in a grandiose way because it was,
Exactly.
well, with little rhyming couplets.
Sure.
And my grandfather, with whom we lived during the war, had a gentleman friend who had never married. He was a very distinguished judge. His last name was Biddle, which is a very famous name in Pennsylvania. You would have no way of knowing that because you're in Texas. But at any rate, Judge Biddle was a good friend of my grandfather's. And Judge Biddle was a very literary man, a retired judge. And he took an interest in me because I had an interest, even as a child, in literature. And
Mm.
so one time, I used to sometimes, small town Pennsylvania, knock on his door. His manservant would come to the door and invite me in, and I would have a cup of tea with the judge. At any rate, one time I gave him a book of poems that I had written. It was actually, a little notebook that I had bought at the local
Mhm.
stationery store, and each page had a very bad poem on it. And also, I'm ashamed to say, I had decorated with stickers. I was, probably 8 or 9 at the time. And many years later, I was a sophomore in college, majoring in writing, when I got a letter from a Philadelphia law firm telling me of the death of a man named Judge Edward McFadden Biddle III, and I had been mentioned in his will. And also, they had enclosed a package, which was my little book of poems that they had found in his desk. And he had left me, I may get this wrong, but I want to say 1/2 of 1% of his estate. Uh, he probably hoped that I would use it to further my literary studies in graduate school or something. But
Yes,
I was an adolescent, even though I was 19 at the time,
of
and
course.
I bought a car, and I dropped out of college and drove with my boyfriend, who quickly became my husband. I was 19, he was 21.
Oh, with all the maturity and the foresight of a 19-year-old, absolutely. I'm going to drop out of college and buy a car and
I'm going to drive this Pontiac across the United States, and we're going to live in California. Any rate, so that's confessions of somebody who made a lot of stupid choices when she was young. But then we all did, didn't we?
that's a big part of being young, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Then, all right. So, were you building your confidence as a writer? And so now we're getting into opportunities to be able to do that. So how did that happen? So you're in California and you're building, or you still, did you have an Underwood or Underwood portable? Did you, what was your, well,
Okay.
Smith Corona? I love those mechanical typewriters, the little portables that we would carry around.
I mentioned the gift of a bicycle that my father gave me.
Exactly.
My
Which
third,
comes in.
yes, but on my 13th birthday, we're still in Japan. This was a monumental gift at the time. It wouldn't be now, when every kid, my grandchildren all got computers when they were 10.
Of
But this,
course.
my father gave me a portable typewriter in Tokyo for my 13th birthday. It was a Smith Corona. It's the same typewriter that I took to college. where I'd been given a scholarship to study writing, and I took that Smith Corona with me and used it for many years. So by the time I dropped out and took my Smith Corona in the Pontiac with my husband, new boy husband, and we settled in San Diego because he was an ensign in the Navy. He'd gone through college on a naval ROTC scholarship.
Right.
So we settle in San Diego. He immediately gets on a destroyer and heads to the Far East, and I'm alone with my typewriter in San Diego in a cheap apartment. $61.
Beautiful San Diego, magnificent. I lived there for a couple of years. I mean, it's an extraordinary place.
Yeah. So I thought, I mean, my husband's salary was very small, and I was a new bride, and I thought the thing to do would be to get a job. And there was an ad in the San Diego paper for somebody to work for the San Diego paper in the classified ads department. And I thought that was just the job for me. I mean, picture the high degree of literacy that I could bring to writing an ad for free kittens. And so I think I even went in for an interview, and I didn't get the job because I didn't have any qualifications. So although that was my dream still, to be a writer, it took me a long time to get around to doing it because, in addition to other circumstances, I had 4 children by the time I was 26. And then,
You gestated 4 human beings.
yes, yeah.
We think of it. Here we are in our time in 2024, when reproductive rights are so much on the ballot, and we're really seeing that. And you gestate for how? I mean, that to me is an astonishing thing that you actually made a human being.
It was not unusual at that time to have large numbers of children. I actually wanted to have 6. I don't know why that seemed like a good goal at the time. But when my 4th child, born when I was 25, I guess, began kindergarten. So by now, I can't even tell you how old I would have been, say 30, 31. I went back to college. And it took me 4 years to complete the 2 that I hadn't done. And then I went to graduate school. So for all of those reasons, plus the growing children and the increasingly difficult marriage, because 2 children got married and then grew in other directions.
Exactly, as we do.
As we do. And so it took me a long time to get around to actually doing the writing that I had always aspired to.
Mm-hmm. Then, all right, so that's what happens in that you get to what I'm trying to find is the place where we go. Here we have the giver, where you begin, and the idea from it. And so, and here we have you as a postgraduate writer in that, can you describe that space in between? Yeah, that space in between to where the first inklings, because I want to know about the inklings of the idea of this story that I want to dig into with you about the giver. So describe that liminal space.
Okay. And I'm trying to put it together in my head now, and it is fitting into place a little bit. When I said a minute ago that I still wanted to be a writer, had always wanted to be a writer, and when I was in graduate school, I guess, having gotten a degree now in English literature, in graduate school, I had room to take some courses other than literature courses, and I studied photography, which appealed to me. I've always had a strong visual sense, And then I found that I could actually, sitting in my house in Maine where we lived, typing. By now I had upgraded to an electric typewriter.
Ooh.
It was still a typewriter, but you could plug it in. Um, I found that I could sell articles to magazines, and I could sell them more easily if I could do the photography that went with them. I set up a
Sure.
darkroom. And so I was a photojournalist, I guess you would say, freelance. And I
Totally.
was doing a lot of that. And I could do it from home, although there was a magazine I worked for who would send me out on assignments. But by then the kids are, say, junior high age and middle school. And so I could take off for a day or two. But fiction was what I wanted to write and what I wrote on the side. And sometimes I sent stories to magazines. Fewer and fewer magazines published fiction by then.
Exactly.
When I was a child, many magazines did. My mother
And,
subscribed to them.
and they were pulp fiction. This is where that comes from, where Heinlein and so many of the science fiction
Yeah,
writers would write by the word, and they would do that. And this is how we
yeah,
support. I mean, this was a whole industry.
exactly. But by the time I was starting to do it, there were fewer and fewer magazines that
Hmm.
published fiction. Nonetheless, I would send my stories written while dinner was cooking and the kids were watching TV, and get the rejection letters. And then now I'm thinking back to what year this would have been, 1975.
Hmm.
I'm in my 30s still, I guess. I was born in 37. I'm not
Yep.
great at math. So let's say I'm 30 some years old.
Yeah.
And it was fall. We lived in Maine. And one morning, I'm in the kitchen, which is where I spent most of my time.
Hmm.
Husband has gone off with his briefcase to his law office because after the Navy, he'd gone to law school. Kids have gone off to school. The Newfoundland dog is asleep on the kitchen floor. And I scrape the kids' breakfast plates into the dog dish and take it out to the back porch. And the dog lumbers along to follow me to get his scraps. And I stopped because there was something about the air. This would have been November 1975, I think. And it brought back a memory. And as soon as I say the word memory, you can hear the giver starting to take shape, even though it doesn't happen for many years. Okay, the air in Maine in November combines, well, first of all, the kids dying pumpkins from Halloween, rotting pumpkins, dead apples from the apple trees out back, wood smoke from a neighbor's stove, the ocean, we lived near the ocean, all of that combined. And it brought back a memory of a time that I was 8 or 9 years old. And I went in the house and I wrote on my electric typewriter, I wrote a letter to a friend, which is what we did in those days, no email. We wrote letters to our friends. And I had a friend who lived in Rhode Island. And I wrote to her frequently, and I just wrote about the memory that this set of smells had brought to me of a day that I spent with my father when I was 8 or 9 years old. The war had ended and he had come home. He had to go back to Japan, but he was home very briefly. And he was a stranger to me, and I was a stranger to him. And it was a story about how we connected on that one day in the fall of whatever year it had been. I wrote that to her. She wrote back to me immediately and she said somebody would buy that story. So I reformatted it, wrote it more as a story, but it was still the true account. And I sent it to Red Book magazine, which I think still exists, but they no longer publish fiction.
Exactly. But that was a big magazine at that time.
Yeah. And they immediately wrote back and said they wanted to publish it, and they did. Okay. So as a matter of fact, I don't know what birthday it would have been of my father's, but I sent him $1 and a birthday card. And I said, your birthday present is at the drugstore. Buy Red Book magazine. And it was a story about him. At any rate, after that story was published, and I was still, and it was a story for adults, but it was seen through the eyes
Sure,
of a child.
of course.
I got a letter from the editor of Red Book magazine enclosing a letter that they had received. And they said, this enterprising editor wants to know how to find you. And it was from a book publisher. And it said, you sound like somebody who could be writing for young people. Would you consider writing a novel for what we call young adults? And it was so unusual to be asked to write something. They didn't promise to publish it, but there was going to be somebody at the other end. I wasn't going to be sending it into a vacuum to a
Who
stranger.
knows?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And so I sat down with another memory. And that's what I wrote about, wrote it as fiction, but in the first person, in the voice of a 13-year-old girl. And it was about the death of her 15-year-old sister. My own sister had died young. And I had been carrying that story around inside my head, my memory, my heart for all those years. And I wrote it as a book for young people. Houghton Mifflin, which was the publisher who had requested it, published it. And it won a very big award. And I suddenly thought, this is what I should be doing. Forget these stories of marriages and adult themes. And what solidified that was the response from kids, because I got passionate letters from young readers, girls. It was what kids think of as a girl book. It was about two girls, and it was about the death of one. But I began to have a renewed awareness. I would have known this myself as a child, but a renewed awareness of what a book can mean to a child, to a young person, the passion that they brought to their responses. And so that's when I took up writing for young people, which I've been doing ever since.
You know, Lois, that's the whole thing that I get, but because just like we all know that what makes great young adult fiction is great fiction, is that you're writing to the human being. They may not have the experience that we have, but they're fully developed beings, and that you write along the themes that carry. I mean, me at 76, as I'm reading The Giver for the first time, as I'm doing, and I'm sitting there, I'm putting myself in there. I'm running, and we're going to get to this in a little bit about the movie, but I'm running the movie in my mind. That's the way I read. I read in a very visual
Yeah, I do.
sense. And so I'm running that in my mind, and I'm seeing his own questioning as he's learning, going into the 12s and being able to do that. So anyway, so how did this world that you were thinking about in The Giver begin to coalesce? Please join us for part 2 of our RSC, where Lois and I explore the origins of The Giver, as well as how the movie of the book came about, and talk to her about her immensely creative life today at 87. See you soon.